Hello and welcome to another edition of Fault Lines. I'm Gauri Dwivedi, and this week on the show, we decode for you the three biggest stories that are happening around the world. First up, Trump's peace gambit. Will that peace formula that Donald Trump has come up will actually be acceptable to Ukraine or not? And is Kyiv on the edge? Because could this be the last of the potential peace formulas on the table? Next up, we tell you about Sudan, which has been referred as the epicenter of human suffering by the United Nations. Millions of lives lost. There's mass rapes, executions. Why is the world not answering, not saying anything? We tell you more on that. And third big story on the show this week on Fault Lines, Israel pounds Lebanon and Gaza. The very tenuous peace hasn't lasted that long. What's next in Middle East? We tell you more of that. First story on the show this week on Fault Lines, viewers. If American media are to be believed and reports are to be believed, all eyes are right now on Washington because of a peace formula that Donald Trump has come up with to end the war in Ukraine that has been going on since February 2022. Now, what has happened is that the plan appears to be highly contentious, as it is already generating enough and more debate across global capitals. And why is that so? Well, what Donald Trump has come up with is, in fact, giving a lot of territory of Ukraine to Russia. That's the peace plan that Donald Trump has come up with. The sweeping territorial compromises is what people in Ukraine are calling this. The plan also includes freezing NATO expansion. Again, things that many feel is too pro-Russia and not really the middle ground of ending this war. Reports also indicate that the US administration is exerting heavy pressure on Kyiv to accept this formula, demanding that it agrees to the peace plan by Thanksgiving, which is the next 4 weeks. Ukraine has told the United Nations that it has reviewed the plan, but it will not give away any inch of its territory. And what is being proposed is actually upwards of almost 20% of Ukraine's territory. Ukraine's UN representative said that there will be no recognition, no formal or otherwise, of any Ukrainian territory that is occupied by the Russian Federation. And there are large swaths of it, whether it's in Donetsk or Luhansk, there are large swaths of it which have been taken over by Russia. And these are also Russian-speaking regions. That's what Moscow has said all along. In fact, Zelensky had earlier said that he's ready for an honest work with the US after receiving a draft peace plan to end the war with Russia. European allies, meanwhile, fear the proposal could redraw the entire strategic balance in the entire region, potentially rewarding aggression while sidelining long-standing diplomatic frameworks. That's the context in which, on one end, the world wants to end this war, but what the plan is on the table, is it good enough? Can it actually solve the puzzle? And most importantly, will that mean that there will be no other Russian aggression on the European continent? That's the larger question. In fact, let's put that out first and foremost. Let's play out that soundbite from Ukraine, and then we get you the big picture.
While Ukraine stands ready to engage in meaningful negotiations to end this war, including at the leaders' level, our red lines are clear and unwavering. There will never be any recognition, formal or otherwise, of Ukrainian territory temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation as Russian. Our land is not for sale.
Our land is not for sale. That's what the Ukraine representative told the United Nations. You want to end the war, but not at terms that are too one-sided. But let's get you what exactly that plan is. And then we'll try and tell you as to whether does it have a chance to pass through and for the war to end. First and foremost, Crimea and Donbass ceded to Russia. Now, Crimea was actually ceded to Russia way back in 2014. And since then, there has not been any global recognition of it. But could this plan essentially mean that there is permanency to that entire aggression? This is the draft. Next up, there is the front lines will be frozen at current positions. Now, viewers, in the last couple of months, the Russian momentum has been very significant, and they've actually been able to go deep inside Ukrainian territory. If these front lines are frozen, it could actually mean large part of Ukrainian territory in Russian hands. Ukraine banned from entering NATO. There's been a lot of clamor that should Ukraine be allowed to enter NATO, should it get a chance to be in EU. All of those things have complicated matters, and this is what one of the solution is, that no NATO for Ukraine. Let that not complicate matters. This is important, admitting Russia to the G8. Now, when was Russia out of the G8? It was in 2015, in fact 2014, way back after, immediately after the Crimean expansion, Crimean aggression, is when Russia was expelled from the G8. It was a very dramatic public event. For it to be brought back essentially means mainstreaming everything that has happened in the last 11 years. Next up, Ukraine military capped at 600,000. Extremely significant, because that means that Ukraine will not have a very sizable military posture. Next up, Ukrainian jets shield Ukraine. European jets shield Ukraine from Poland. Poland, of course, is where the last of the NATO weaponry is stationed at, very close to Moscow. Lastly, $100 billion of Russian assets used to rebuild Ukraine, which has been completely battered in the last almost 4 years that it's going to be in February 2026 from the war. So these are the broad tenets of the peace plan, and many feel that this is actually one-sided, and which is the reason why it's unlikely to come through. Now, as the world viewers passes every detail, one question looms large. Is this a bold breakthrough for peace, or a diplomatic gamble that could reshape the war on terms Ukraine is deeply uncomfortable with? That's the larger question. Let's get in Professor Swaran Singh for a quick word on this. Professor Singh, you've been reading up the peace formula, the roadmap that has been put forth. What are the chances that it will pass through, given Ukraine's deep disagreement with it and a very public posture against it?
Gauri, the third part of today, your show, as you mentioned, will also cover Gaza. And the president's 20-point program on Gaza can be instructive as to what could entail when he's creating 28-point peace plan for Ukraine. This is clearly not built on consensus. This is clearly using American leverages and is virtually challenging and virtually threatening to destroy the whole nation-building project of Ukraine. Because, as you mentioned, large chunks of territories are to be given away, Donbass and Crimea. And of course, Russian language is to be made as second official language. The Roman Catholic Church is to be given official recognition. As you mentioned, armed forces, I can understand for 3.5 years, strict implementation of conscription and so on has bloated armed forces. They could come down.
Back in G8, that's extremely important as well, Professor Singh, because that indicates that Russia is back in the club of the nations that matter, and all that happened is now then behind.
That is clearly an important driver where President Trump is utilizing this opportunity to build peace plan for Ukraine, fundamentally to redefine and stabilize US relations with Russia, build its own economic, rare earths and uranium and so on kind of a relationship, where it is now gradually beginning to anchor Russia into European security architecture, though understanding that Russia is still adversary. That is why what is concerning to me is not just Ukraine, how they are going to deal with it, but European Union, European countries are also giving a muted response by, bandwagoning, pegging on how Ukraine will react, saying it should be conditional to Ukraine accepting it, which means firing from shoulders of Ukrainian leaders.
Which brings me to ask you, sir. Which is that what happens if Zelensky or Ukraine doesn't accept this? What are the repercussions there?
I think it's difficult for President Zelensky, who's already facing domestic scandals, corruption scandals, and so on. And that makes pressures from outside really more difficult to deal with. But whether he's going to accept what is leaked intentionally in media as the 28-point program, peace plan, that much is perhaps expecting far too much from any leader in Ukraine. I think consensus of the entire society in Ukraine will be difficult to build around this kind of plan, whatever we know of it from the media so far, because no official version is as yet available. But it is also true that this time is a really difficult time for President Zelensky. But even in that difficult time, the voices that we are hearing, and you just showed us a comment from Ukrainian officials, it's not something that they can really accept, because this is undoing the very nation building project of Ukraine itself.
Okay.
And for Europe also, it may not really ensure stability in Europe, because focus now is much more on propitiating
Two
President Vladimir
questions.
Putin, perhaps.
Yeah, two questions. It may seem like a long time back, but it was only this year that Zelensky had a very public meeting with Donald Trump where he was pretty much ousted. That was just earlier this year. Since then, there's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of going forward and backward on the Russia-Ukraine peace formula. But when one has to deal with Donald Trump, especially Zelensky, he cannot forget that the fallout could actually be as dramatic as it was earlier this year. So what are Ukraine's options right now on the table?
I think Ukraine needs to work with the European other nations, France, Germany, Britain, and so on, because gradually that was the kind of new scenario evolving where European leaders were understanding and underlining that they need to perhaps become a little more autonomous in terms of building their own national security architecture for Europe. But on this plan, their response as yet is below expectations. I was expecting them to really take it as a challenge, because it's not just Ukraine, it's the entire European security which is going to be impacted, where US is fundamentally disowning. It's virtually trying to, get out of being the main force in ensuring stability and
This
security
peace
in Europe.
formula, Professor Singh, what this peace formula also says is that Donald Trump, or rather American establishment right now, has no regard or is not even in dialogue with its European partners about how deeply uncomfortable they would be to ensure that Russia is back into the G8, to ensure that Russia is able to hold on to the territory that it's managed to get right now during the military confrontation, and also the fact that there's been complete sidelining as far as Ukrainian interests are concerned, all of which that would make the French, the British, and even German very deeply uncomfortable. My final question to you very quickly, sir, which is this then indicative of the fact that the US-European relations or interests right now are completely divergent on this issue?
I think it is partly also the way European leaders have recently behaved on issue of Ukraine, repeatedly showcasing their presence collectively in White House and propitiating President Trump on many issues, including Gaza. And this 28-point program coming out in media without any consultation with European leaders. I can understand Ukraine, but European leaders should have been taken in confidence. And otherwise, this looks like a direct conversation between President Putin and President Trump, where everybody else seems to be just expendable.
Well, the last time they met, it was clearly that Vladimir Putin got a much better end of the deal at the Alaska summit. I'm going to leave it there. Professor Singh, thanks much for speaking to me on Fault Lines. Well, viewers, shifting focus now to what is being termed as the epicenter of human suffering. This is happening in Sudan. There is nobody who's speaking about it in European capitals or in university campuses or writing long op-eds in global newspapers. But we at Fault Lines are going to tell you where exactly this epicenter of human suffering is. Sudan is at breaking point, viewers. The nation has been battered by relentless war that has been going on for 2.5 years. It is one of its worst civilian conflicts in its history. In fact, the capital of suffering is now described by the UN as the epicenter of misery on earth. That's how terrible the situation is in Sudan. The fall of the Al-Fashar after an 18-month RSF siege, by the way, has in fact turned the historic city into what humanitarians are actually calling and saying is a crime scene in real time. 40,000 people have been killed. Millions of people have been driven out of their homes. There are mass executions that are taking place, mass rapes are taking place. Entire neighborhoods have been completely erased. There's no word on it. Nobody's talking about it. It's a deeply uncomfortable reality that you will not find masihas and saviors of humanity talking about by putting European capitals on siege. But we are going to look at where exactly the fault lines lie, who still holds the line, and whether civilian forces can indeed change the trajectory of a war that's absolutely spiraling out of borders. But first up, I'm going to put you through some statistics that are so deeply worrying, viewers, but it will also put this entire war into context for you. Let's put that out first and foremost for you. The numbers that essentially tell the misery for you. First, 40,000 people have been killed so far in the last 2 years alone. 40,000 people, viewers. 12 million is the number of people in Sudan who've been forced from their homes. These are civilian people who had no business to be caught in the middle of the crossfire. But look at the number that has now been displaced. 18-month siege that has taken on in Al-Fashir, and it hasn't ended. It's not like there is a peace formula on the table and global leaders are meeting to discuss how to end the war in Sudan. No, nobody's bothered about it. Look at the number of hospitals, 450 dead in one hospital. That's the extent of human misery. 57,000 have been displaced in Al-Daba. That's the second place where we're talking about. And you know, these are numbers that they're not really capturing the extent of misery. They are, in all probability, they are underestimating, simply because nobody can actually understand the extent of what's happening, because these are all estimates by which they are going. Even those numbers are so worrying. Next up, 1,365 lawsuits have been filed by survivors. And the last and the most important part, what is happening there for people who've been able to survive the civilian conflict? They are dealing with a famine, a cholera, and the possibility of aid being completely blocked out. That's where things are right now. But viewers, do not let these numbers appear as just mere statistics. They are not just metrics. These are lives lost. These are people whose lives have been completely unraveled, promising futures completely trampled. But behind these statistics are families running through fields without water, children flinching at a stranger's shadow, and viewers, mothers carrying the bodies of their children on their back. That is what this entire story is. But let's tell you about the conflict per se, as to how long it has been going on and why Sudan is where it is, with this report that has all the details for you.
Sudan's war didn't erupt in a vacuum. It began in April 2023. This when the country's two former allies, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, turned their guns towards each other. What came next plunged a fragile nation into freefall. 2.5 years later, Sudan is a landscape of ashes. 12 million people displaced, entire towns emptied overnight, and Al-Fashir, the beating heart of Darfur, now a city of silent ruins.
بعد أنا كنا ماشيين في الشارع تعليم من مدينة الفاشر، وفي إحدى الشوارع لقينا بعض من ميليشيات الدعم السريع وقفونا في الشارع وفتشوا حاجاتنا وتحرشوا فينا وأخذوا ممتلكاتنا، ما خلوا لنا حاجة، وبعد برضو في نحب وضرب معاناة شديد يعني.
The RSF's takeover of Al-Fashir followed a grimly familiar script the world has seen repeating on loop. Encirclement, starvation, shelling, and finally storming. What followed was nothing short of industrial-scale brutality. Mass execution sites visible from satellite images, sexual violence weaponized with intent, and over 450 people killed in a single maternity hospital. a place meant to bring new life into the world.
We need just that sustained pressure on all the actors to demonstrate that this has gone on too long, and that the methods of war, the level of impunity around this conflict, is utterly unacceptable.
And yet, diplomacy remains a tug of war. The US, Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia have pushed for a 90-day truce. But the guns are still doing the talking on the ground. The battle for Sudan has become a struggle between force and legitimacy, between fear and hope, a struggle between collapse and the courage to begin again. And in cities like Al-Fashir, where the sand itself holds the memory of massacres, Sudan's future is being written, heartbreak after heartbreak. Bureau Report, NDTV World.
On that note, viewers, slipping into a very short break, we come back on the other side, tell you more about what's happening in Middle East, where Israel is pounding Lebanon and Gaza. The tenuous peace is just one shot away from becoming a full-scale war yet again. We tell you more after this break. Getting you details now about what's happening in Middle East, where it's clearly that a fresh fighting may take place soon. Why? Because West Asia is on the boil yet again. Israeli airstrike hit southern Lebanon this week, killing at least 13 people during that entire conflict. And in fact, one of the deadliest attacks since last year's hostilities. Israeli military said it targeted a training compound of Hamas embedded in the camp. Local residents and families are disputing it, saying that this was a sports field for youth gathering area with no militant presence. Take a look at this report.
Southern Lebanon rattled by Israeli strikes, the deadliest in the country since last year's ceasefire. Reports suggest more than a dozen people have been killed in the attack on a Palestinian refugee camp on the coastal city of Cede. Ambulances rushed into the camp and chaotic scenes as Hamas fighters prevented journalists from reaching the scene.
نحن نقول له لن نسكت لن نسكت لن نسكت. نحن أبناء عين الحلوة وأبناء المخيمات وأبناء عاصمة الشتات عين الحلوة. لن نسكت هذا الفعل.
Israel's military says the strike targeted a training compound used by Hamas to prepare attacks against Israeli forces and vows to continue such operations whenever the group is active. But Hamas strongly denied the claim, asserting the target was a sports playground, not a militant training site. Southern Lebanon is reeling under escalating tensions for weeks, with the Israeli army intensifying near-daily air raids inside Lebanese territory, allegedly targeting Hezbollah members. With tensions rising across the region, the latest strike underscores how fragile the ceasefire remains and how ordinary civilians continue to bear the brunt of escalating hostilities. Bureau Report, NDTV World.